So Howie, thank you so much for coming to chat with me about your work. We have your segment appearing in our chapter on intercultural communication, but I know that's kind of a misnomer to describe what you do. And I came to know your work from the early work you did on intercultural communication and communication accommodation theory, but I know you've focused much more now on thinking about intercultural communication as intergroup communication. And much as I think we talk about it within the book, you recognize that most of our interactions are intergroup in some ways, and that trying to parse what is interpersonal and intercultural and intergroup is really a difficult task. So you've had a real journey moving from some of your early research on cultural differences to some of your work on group differences. So let's begin by telling us a little bit about your journey and how you came to study what you study and what you think is important.
Well, I started off in my ill-begotten youth with a variety of accents. And I came from a city in Cardiff. You can probably tell I'm not American. I first became interested in communication, listening to myself talk, which sounds somewhat self-indulgent, but I was born in Cardiff, which has its own particular accent that sounds a bit like this, you see. And we talk like this, and we put S's on the ends of words, and we have non-verbal moments that go with it. And I noticed this, and also switching into a South Welsh accent, which is very different and very lilting. And involves a different culture, actually, because you would use a Cardiff accent if you went to a soccer game, which involves culture, but a South Welsh accent if you go to rugby, which is very different, you see. So I thought, well, am I a chameleon? What is happening here? So I go to college in North Wales, and that's South Wales, North Wales, and they speak very differently up there, you see, and there's no humour, and the non-verbals are very strict, etc. And so I thought, wow, this is getting worse. And then when I was at college, most of the people were from London, very English, and spoke very much like this, very Queen's English. So I was now quadrilingual. And I went back home thinking, what on earth is happening to me? Am I different, or does everybody do this? And I thought, well, I'd better go home now and not talk with plums in my mouth to my mother, who will be offended. So I talked in a Cardiff accent. I said, I'm back, Mum, what do you think about it? All the stuff that's been going on. And she said, don't you talk like that. You don't, our father and mother don't talk like that. And of course, they do. And I was accommodating to her. So I thought, how does one understand this? Is it important? And there were no theories in communication about that at the time. And I was also involved as a hospital porter in Cardiff again, and it was my job in the vacation time to take patients who came in. I logged them in and sat them down, and then I would call them in to the physician. And one day a woman came, and the doctor asked her what her problem was, and she said in a very standard accent, she said, well, I got this terrible pain in my back, doctor, I don't know whether you can do anything about it. And he drew his chair up, I recall, and made a lot of notes, and asked her a series of questions. And asked her about her marital state, back problems with marital states, apparently. And he then said, well, I'm going to send you to another clinic, and that's here, and it's down. He got out of his seat, and you go there, and here's a prescription for you. Well, the next woman, much like a communication experiment, came in, same age, dressed very similarly, but she said, oh, doctor, no, this is Southwestern English, you see. Doctor, she said, I got this terrible pain in my back. Same thing, almost the same words. And he said, yes, fine, take this to pharmacy. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. Maybe this is the 48th back complaint he's had in a row. I don't think so. But it suggested to me that her voice projected a particular social category membership that later on I found doctors were very, very uncomfortable with working class patients, which the accent was associated with, and had problems with it, and even acknowledged having problems with it. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting, because this could be a life or death situation. It probably wasn't in that case, and so that really inspired me to think about the role of accent, which is often thought to be a British disease, but accents are very important in this country, and every time I open my mouth, someone says to me, "Where do you come from?" And I say, "Santa Barbara." No, where do you really come from? I say, "I really come from Santa Barbara." It drives them crazy. And so I'm kind of almost not thought of as an American. People have real problems adjusting to me, whereas in fact I'm an American citizen. So that's how it all started.
Now, and that moving from work on accents in England to the kinds of things that you've been doing in your research with the police, in your research on intergenerational communication, how did you get from there to the kinds of questions that you're pursuing now?
Again, personal experiences. I had worked in a number of different intergroup contexts, gender, gay, straight relationships, age ones, and I thought I really would like to study police-civilian interactions. And I had police in my family, both sides of my family, in fact, and so I went for a phone interview because I thought if you're going to study, say, Samoans or whatever, it's important to become part of that particular culture. So I thought I'll try and part-time become a cop. So I had a phone interview and asked various questions, and they asked me how tall I was. I said 6'8", as you know, and then they asked my age, and I told them my age, and they said, "Well, unless you go to London, the Metropolitan Police, you're too old." And that kind of was a big event for me. Metaphorically, I felt the portcullis come down, the drawbridge come up, and I was kind of marooned now, only in academia as such. And then many years later, I had the opportunity of joining the Santa Barbara Police Department. Many years later than that, I was twice the age when I retired from the police department than when they said I was too old in England. So that in many ways introduced me to police culture. It introduced me to looking at age also as a culture. And in fact, while we think of culture often relating to nationality and ethnicity, in fact there are so many cultures, as you know, out there: cop culture, adolescent culture, age culture, deaf culture, etc., 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 academic culture, interpersonal communication culture.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that last point, because I think that's always I know when students come into this class, they often think about culture in terms of something you encounter when you study abroad.
Right.
And they think about nationality, and they think about ethnicity, and sometimes they think about gender and religion. But when you think about culture and what you've come to really focus on is intergroup communication, you're really looking at different kinds of social categories and social identities. Can you describe that a little bit, help unpack that for the students in the class?
Well, I guess the great distinction that you draw out in the book is between a situation that is intergroup versus interpersonal. And what that means in general is that sometimes our interactions are based purely on our social category membership. So am I talking to Linda as a woman, thinking about her as a member of that particular category, or am I talking about Linda or a publisher, which has its own additional culture? And very different processes underlie intergroup communication versus interpersonal communication. Social identities become important. How you view your group becomes important. That's not on an interpersonal basis. And the architect of social identity theory, who really got this field going, Henri Tacheville, provocatively argued that 70% of interpersonal encounters are actually intergroup encounters. Because people are trying to pigeonhole each other and try and get information based on their category memberships. And I, over the years studying intergroup communication, I've come almost to the conclusion that about 90% of them are. Yeah. And so even, which is the meat and veg of interpersonal communication, long-term relationships, heterosexual relationships, I think can be obviously very intimate, very interpersonal, but at other times they can shift even within the same conversation to intergroup. You know? Why am I doing the dishes? Why am I, taking the child out to school, etc., where these are intergroup issues.
Whereas suddenly the interaction
Yeah.
is cast as I'm talking to you as my wife,
Yes.
or I'm talking to you as my husband. And husbands have certain traits that you may or may not have, but
Exactly.
that becomes the focal point of the conversation. Yeah. Very interesting. So how I'm interested in, we've talked about your path and the kind of work that you've done.
Mm-hmm.
As you look to the future, what do you think are some of the more important research questions in this area that people are taking up? Or what do you think are some of the most important discoveries that we've had in the past that we're going to carry into the future?
Okay. Let's talk about discoveries first, perhaps. One very important one to me relates to bilingualism, which I think is kind of interesting. That most people in the world actually speak 5 languages, which kind of shocks monolingual Americans and Brits. So in this age of globalization, bilingualism and multilingualism is a very, very important issue, particularly given that language is such an integral part of one's national identity and ethnic identity, but does not appear in indexes of most intercultural texts, which is interesting. It's an area that's been kind of sidestepped, but is very important. So I see this, particularly in this day and age when ethnic minorities in Europe have been superimposed by this European identity, and now revitalizing their languages and revitalizing their culture. So I see this as a very important area that people in intergroup communication, as well as interpersonal communication, speaking to someone in a different tongue, is a very important topic for the future. And this relates to one discovery that I think is interesting, and some people might say it's a non-finding, because I'm dealing here with a correlation of 0. And there have been thousands of studies now done outside communication, in education and psychology, about what factors predict proficiency in another language or another dialect. And there appears to be 0 correlation in the number of years you expend learning another language and your proficiency in it, which is at some level astounding. And so, intergroup communication, people have been looking at the factors that will actually predict proficiency in another language, and it's related to how you feel about your own identity, how you feel about that other group's identity whose language you're going to learn, and especially their culture, and it is this that predicts proficiency, and therefore I see communication being an important part of high school classes in learning a second language, or people who come to a country who are education abroad students. You need communication to understand this language. You're not learning a language, you're learning a culture, and your relationship historically with that group is extremely important. So I see that as a huge area.
Well, it seems obvious in some ways as we think about what students who are studying this course will learn about language in a few chapters, and the way in which language works, because we understand the social context, and we're able to say things that have no real meaning unless we understand what's going on within the situation, what opportunities are available in them. And so to imagine that we can teach somebody a second language without teaching them or giving them an appreciation for how those things unfold within the context,
Right.
suddenly it seems very obvious as you describe it that way. So,
Well, unfortunately for most educators and other people, it's quite not obvious.
yeah. So to bring the culture and the context to be part of understanding language learning, very important. I know I work with some faculty at Penn State who study bilingualism from the point of view of understanding how it activates different parts of the brain. And bilingualism has protective factors against things like Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yes.
And so anything we can do to promote the proficiency in the second language has these kinds of long-term benefits as well. So you've really turned a focus to, well, you still continue to study many things, but I know among them is really understanding communication and aging. And I think people are sometimes surprised when they first encounter the idea that communication with a grandparent who is in your linguistic community and is in your cultural in-group can still constitute intergroup communication.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that most people have friends, close relationships with those within their own particular age group, which is kind of interesting in itself. Very few people have, as young people, friends much older than they can call friends. In fact, a survey I give my students in my aging class asks them to make estimations about the amount of contact they have with different age groups. And consistently over the years, students say they have about 8% contact with older people. Older people say over 65. When you throw in grandparents, it comes to the staggering number of 12%. In other words, young people don't have much contact with older people, and vice versa. Older people don't have much contact. It's almost as though they're alien cultures. And unfortunately, we find that young people avoid older people based on various stereotypes and communicative stereotypes that they have about older people. And there are large gaps, and I think we and other people, including your own colleagues at Penn State, have been looking at communication across the lifespan. And one thing that's forgotten here is that the lifespan involves different cultures. Adolescent culture, preteen culture, tween cultures. And people don't often recognize this. And sometimes intergenerational communication problems between older and younger people are not so much based on stereotypes, although often they are, but the fact that each group has been born into a particular culture at a historical moment. I think about events in my life, like the shooting of Kennedy, even in Britain, that still I remember where I was, what I was doing, and how I talked about these things. 9/11, which in a few decades young people won't even be able to think, what are you talking about? So people don't recognize these cultural differences are related to age. And they think, oh, well, I've been young myself, I know all about it. No, you have no idea, because you have not been brought up in this particular culture as such. And so people are missing each other as such. I remember my son, he was 9 at the time, and he came into the room and I was watching MTV. And he turned it off. And I said, what are you doing, son? I said, that's cool. He said, don't use that word cool to me. He said, that's our word. Okay? And in any case, it has 3 more vowels than you think it does. And 3 weeks ago, it changed into another term. And by the way, do not be watching MTV. That is our culture. He didn't say the word culture, but he said, that is our territory. So I think of the lifespan as a 400-meter hurdle race, where there's different kind of barriers that you go over, you jump over, and you can't go back. If you knock one down, you have to carry on going. And you can't go back into that culture because it becomes the preserve of the next generation as such. So a lot of interesting, I think, intercultural things happen. And take adolescence again. People think this is a bizarre phase that certain people go through and mature out of. But I think in terms of what I've just been talking about, it is a culture with its own norms and communicative practices. And that if people can understand that this is not just a phase, but a culture, and appreciate that and learn about it and exchange ideas about this culture, I think a lot of the so-called socially constructed crises that occur will dissipate away. And again, I think this is something that future research could attend to and have some pragmatic payoffs.
Well, and I think your insights really highlight the way in which communication reinforces those. Because if I have this perception of adolescence, then it drives my communication with my almost adolescent son in ways that make it very easy for him to fall into the adolescent stereotype, because I've already projected that onto him. And I think about conversations with my grandfather, who wore a hearing aid, and he was a very cute Hawaiian man who said very little, drove my Hawaiian grandmother around. We were visiting them the year before I went to graduate school, and he said almost nothing, and he laughed at all the right moments, and he was just this very cute Hawaiian man. And then my dad and my grandmother got out of the car, and he turned his hearing aid on, and he turned around and he said, so you're going to Northwestern. I know that's a very good school, but what exactly are you studying? Because not all of their strengths are equal. And I had this, shocking moment where he had stepped out of the role that he had been kind of happily hiding behind, and he didn't let anyone else see this moment in him. And I felt like I'd been given this little gift. We'd had this exchange.
Yes.
But
nice of you to think in those terms.
If we were able to kind of, because he stepped out of his role, but if he hadn't, I would have happily just treated him as my cute little Hawaiian grandfather and stayed in this way that reinforced our cultural groups and not ever had that sort of more authentic conversation.
Right.
So I think you're talking about recognizing the ways in which these are cultures allows us to appreciate them as opposed to just reify them without thought.
That's right, that's right. Very complex processes. I'm thinking about my own father who had problems hearing and would not put on some device, hearing aid, and I used to tell him that that they don't show anymore. They're very, very saying, no, he didn't want this because the notion that if he had a hearing aid was reinforcing an old age perspective as such. And I recall that very often people would say, I can't do this because I'm too old now, or someone makes it, oh, I've forgotten that, I'm too old. So I sometimes metaphorically slap people who do this in the sense of saying, don't be saying that, it's the rocky road down communicatively. And we've been finding in some of our studies that actually people start doing this at 25. And I did this to my dad on one occasion. He said, I invited him to a party of communication people because he was visiting, and I said, I'd love you to come to the party. He said, no. I said, I'm too old for that. I tell her. So I metaphorically slapped him and said, no, don't be thinking in those terms. He said, don't be silly. I know this excuse works. Okay? So I thought, there's always another layer. There's always another layer.
Strategic, yeah. So, Howie, tell me what advice you have for students at a more practical level now as they look ahead to future jobs, future family life.
I was at a generic level, I would say, as there aren't that many, as we know, communication positions as such, although there are many communication consultancies, most people move out of communication to do other things. And my experience is with students coming back, that they sometimes forget their communication theory and some of the skills they've learned through our teaching, and talk about what they're doing in their work. And I said, well, that's all communication, isn't it? Haven't you thought about that? And they said, oh, no. It's as though people kind of finish. It's like they finish a course, done that, forgot that, go on to another communication course, because they're interrelated very much. And so I think it's very much the same. There's a tendency to move on to careers, but then forget that 80% of those careers are actually communicative. When it comes to when I was a police officer that you mentioned earlier, continual training, unlike academics, and 90% of it was physical defense. Very, very little communication training as such. Whereas in fact 80% of the job is dealing with the public and different members of the public. So most workplace situations, businesses are intricately related to communication, and also economics, business. I think there's great potential for us to be looking at the way in which communication fuses with economic business issues. I teach a course on sport culture and communication, and try to make the point that while one is enjoying this as a sport, it's actually a huge, big business. And those dynamics really, if you understand them, affect how you watch the game, how you participate in the game, etc., etc. So I would say for students is to remember your heritage, remember your upbringing, because you can call upon it constantly, and sometimes we can't always think communicatively, otherwise we'd drive ourselves crazy probably if we were constantly aware of it. But I think Sometimes to think about your heritage and use it in practice can make you sound so much more sophisticated, elegant, and understand things that are going on between business partners and your clients and your customers that otherwise you would miss.
Oh, terrific advice. So thinking about advice for students, I mean, your examples, even from securing a curry in a fine Pakistani restaurant, it's about how your ability to see across these differences and to communicate across these differences, whether it's in the workplace when you can understand the perspective of an older supervisor or somebody from a different ethnic group who is one of your coworkers, you break down that intergroup barrier and you're able to achieve something.
Indeed.
And that's priceless.
It is priceless, and another gift, to use your word. And so finally, okay, just developing that just a little bit, I think it's important not only to think about one's communication skills and theory, but also to think cautiously about being in a situation of, am I talking to someone based on their individual personal identities and idiosyncrasies and temperament and personality, or am I dealing with them as a member of a social category? And all of us have to do this at some level to move on and make guesses and second guesses how to be appropriate, whatever. But also, is that person talking to me as a member of a social category? Are they dismissing me as an individual, Howie, or because I'm a professor, or sound British, or a police officer? And I think understanding when we shift from interpersonal to intergroup can be enormously helpful in terms of oiling the wheels of interpersonal communication.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.